Hello, Connect groups. Apart from Jesus and perhaps David, I think that Joseph's life is the most documented faith race where any one of the hurdles he faced could have stopped it dead. Now, before we all start singing, I closed my eyes, drew back the curtain. Let's see what those hurdles were and how he ran with perseverance. The first hurdle he came across is when he was a teenager. Now, he knew from his great-grandfather Abraham that there was a covenant God had made with the family to produce a nation, to give them a land, and yet he was second to last of all the brothers. Now imagine knowing as you're growing up that the firstborn son Reuben is the most likely to continue these family promises. And suddenly he is given some dreams by God of his father and mother and all of his brothers bowing down to him. Now, what would he conclude about that? That perhaps the covenant promises would come through him? Well, these dreams went to his head. They were given for understanding at a much later date in a far-off country, but at the time he didn't respond with faith, but with arrogance. It got him in murderous-hearted trouble with his brothers. But interestingly, Jacob kept it in mind, didn't he? Because Jacob knew what the family dynamics had been for 3 generations already, so wasn't too surprised. Now, even though these dreams bolstered Joseph's faith, they brought out a naive pride in him, which hindered his relationships. So the first hurdle to recognize in Joseph's life is this: sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of your pride and arrogance. Well, he experienced a life-devastating moment when he was sold into slavery by his brothers, and his position was in Potiphar's household. It was evidence that God was with him, and this had given him faith, a stronger faith for his race. Now, how? Not just because he had great responsibility, but because he didn't sin sexually with Potiphar's wife. Why not? He could have. From a worldly point of view, he was at the top of where he was probably going to be in society. So why not sleep with the top woman? Well, he had faith in his covenant God, even though the covenant family had rejected him. This is an extraordinary conclusion to come to as an enslaved young man with no hope of returning to the covenant land. Even though God was with Joseph in many ways that brought great faith and blessing, he had to resist sin that could have so easily entangled him in his faith race. So here's the second hurdle to remember. Sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of temptation. Well, he ended up in prison for refusing the woman, and once again his faith was bolstered because God had given him responsibility over the prisoners. On top of that, 2 particular people, the cupbearer to Pharaoh and the baker, came in. They had dreams. Joseph interpreted them, but it shows us that Joseph still hadn't quite got the total faith in God's plan, because he tried to bust himself out of prison by gaining favor with the cupbearer who was returning to Pharaoh. 2 years goes by for Joseph to learn that his faith must be in God's plan, not his own. Finally, Pharaoh has dreams. Joseph's let out. He interprets them, and suddenly he is number 2 in all of Egypt. His faith must have been tremendously strengthened through this. Even though Joseph was used for miraculous moments, he was given responsibility far beyond normal recognition and built up in faith. He could still grow weary and lose heart, though severely protracted, even though he experienced severely protracted and limited circumstances. So here's the third hurdle. Sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of apparently dead-end circumstances. Well, this faith was put to the test because, of course, he had unforgiveness and bitterness in his heart. When he met his brothers after many years, suddenly, with this forgiveness and bitterness rising up, he has power and he has opportunity to make his brothers suffer when he finds them on their knees in front of him, begging for food in the famine that has ravaged the homeland. And instead of fixing his eyes on the covenant God and the covenant mercy of God, which he'd experienced a lot of in his years and life story, for the revenge set before him, he played a dangerous, manipulative and self-centered game with his brothers over many, many months. He was torn between two desires. On one hand, he wanted to hurt as he had been hurt. On the other hand, he had faith that God was using him to bring about covenant promises to the covenant family, even though the covenant land was being ravaged by famine. He had food and influence to work the situation either way, and he chose to have faith, and he acted with forgiveness, reconciliation, and he got to see his younger brother Benjamin and his father once again. And the exercise of his faith saved the covenant community. The fourth point is this: sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of bitterness and unforgiveness. Well, just as you think that Joseph doesn't need any more lessons in faith, his father dies. His brothers come, they throw themselves before him and ask for forgiveness once again, just in case Joseph gets mad about what has happened and Jacob the father was the only restraining hand in the situation. They remind him of his father's plea for mercy and forgiveness, and maybe he felt tempted to resurrect that unforgiveness and bitterness. We're not told, but what we are told is that he had to come to a conclusion about the whole situation. He humbly concludes, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And just when you think this line should finish the movie, the music swells, the curtains close, and the lights come on with this final statement of faith ringing in your ears, there's more, one more. Joseph's story finishes with one more request of faith. He knows that the covenant promises for the covenant family should be worked out in the covenant land. But he's brought them all to Egypt. So in faith, even though he doesn't get to see it, he makes this final faith request: when you leave Egypt and go home, take my bones with you. I want to be part of it even then. The final point is this: the faith race is begun by God and is finished by him, even to the last moments of life and beyond. Joseph's life is an incredible continuing story of faith. Here's those 5 points once again. You might want to choose one of them for sharing testimony on, or even discussing in the Connect group now. Firstly, sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of your pride and arrogance. Sometimes, too, your faith race meets the hurdle of temptation. 3, sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of apparently dead-end circumstances. 4, sometimes your faith race meets the hurdle of bitterness and unforgiveness. And 5, the faith race is begun by God and finished by him, even to the last moments of life and beyond. In so many ways, Joseph's life, it points us to Jesus as a type of him in the Old Testament. But in this area of faith, he becomes one of many that the book of Hebrews refers to when pointing us to Jesus in our vision verses for church this year, which say, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." I hope that Joseph and our Lord Jesus inspire us this evening, or whenever you're watching this, to once again think of the hurdles that we face on our faith race. Bless you in your conversations and your prayers for one another now. Bye-bye.